the 7 basin states have avoided 7-state litigation in the last 100 years since the compact has been signed, and we're really hoping to continue to avoid litigation, but we'll have to see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into it. These are kind of your, cocktail party facts about the Colorado River. A lot of them I'm sure you already know, but I just want to emphasize how important the Colorado River is to the southwestern United States. Provides, water supply for 40 million people, 30 Indian tribes, 7 US states, and the country of Mexico. And another thing that I think is important to note is hydropower production across the American Southwest. So, when we talk sometimes, you'll hear me talk about the importance of levels at Lake Mead and Lake Powell. This is one of the reasons that matters, is because it also provides power to a big part of the Southwest. But let's just zoom in on Colorado right now. And this is a good time to mention, I definitely come at this from a Colorado perspective. I work for the state of Colorado. I am an attorney by training, so it's kind of hard to get that advocate out of me. But my job, I see, is really protecting Colorado's interest in the Colorado River, and it is critically important to our state. Sorry, I'm not good. Oh, shoot.
Sorry, complications with Zoom. Hold on one second.
So yeah, the Colorado River is really, really important to us in Colorado. It, again, provides 40% of our state's water supply, depending on the year. And it's not only the west slope that we think about a lot that depends on the Colorado River for things like Palisade peaches and a lot of agriculture, but also on the Front Range. A lot of the supply of the Front Range comes from the Colorado River as well through Trans Mountain diversions. Thank you.
Yeah.
So So I want to start by going over 100 years back in history. And just to start, this slide shows what we call the law of the Colorado River. So these are all the legal documents that kind of govern how the Colorado River is managed. There are people who would come in here and argue that certain components of this are not part of the law of the river. In fact, I might edit myself and say not all this is considered part of the law of the river. It's kind of an evolving definition. And I'm definitely not going to talk about all these things today, but I want to just hit a few highlights that I think really form the foundation of how the Colorado River is managed today and why we're kind of in the place that we are today on the Colorado River. So I'm going to start with the Colorado River Compact of 1922. You've probably read a lot about and heard a lot about the compact in the news. There are a lot of different legal theories about what the compact means and what it does. But I think it's important just to start with the plain language of the compact. And I would encourage everyone to go read it. It's actually very short, which I think is a benefit and a complication. But at any rate, a few of the key provisions, Article 2A, this defines what the Colorado River system is. And I would note here that it includes tributaries, not just the main stem, but also tributaries. And you will understand why that's important a little bit later. Article 3A apportions water out of that system. So in other words, it apportions the water of the main stem and the tributaries, 7.5 million acre feet to the upper basin, 7.5 to the lower basin. And this article is critically important to Colorado, and it kind of goes back to the whole reason the compact was envisioned to begin with. In the early 1920s, California was developing very rapidly, and they were developing very early rights on the Colorado River. And also in the early 1920s, you had a Supreme Court case come down that said if there are neighboring states and they're arguing about how much water they should be apportioned in a shared river basin, that prior appropriation is going to apply across state lines. So our chief negotiator at that time in Colorado, Delph Carpenter, looked downstream, saw California developing really rapidly, saw the Supreme Court case came out, which he actually argued on behalf of the state of Colorado, interestingly enough, and he said, no, that's not going to work. California is developing so much faster than we are. We need to preserve our right to have a future in Colorado, to have Colorado River water that we can rely on into the future, even though California is developing really quickly. So where there is a compact, where there's an interstate water compact, and this was the first interstate water compact, by the way, That's going to govern rather than the Supreme Court doctrine that governed that other case. So this compact is really what rules the day. So when you hear the idea that California has senior water rights on the Colorado River, I'm here to tell you that is false, and that is the entire reason this compact came to be, so that we as a state could preserve our ability to grow into the future and not have to have a race to the bottom with California, because we knew that we would lose that race, and that wouldn't be fair. So again, upper basin, lower basin each get 7.5 million acre feet apportioned to them forever. And that's an annual amount of water that we, in theory, have the right to. Article 3B gives the lower basin an additional 1 million acre feet to develop. And what is a theme throughout Colorado River Basin negotiations is that Arizona always comes in at the last minute with some off the wall idea or demand that they need. And this was about that. And it really was about the tributaries in the lower basin, that they needed an additional 1 million acre feet because the tributaries are included in all this, right? So they wanted that additional 1 million acre feet. So really the lower basin gets 8.5, the upper basin gets 7.5. Article 3D may be the most contentious written about article of the compact. I will note it comes after 3A, first and foremost. But what it says is that the upper division states shall not cause the flow of the river to be depleted below 75 million acre feet over a 10-year period. That is confusing language. But if you read the negotiating minutes, if you read all the documents leading up to the compact, what was intended by that was not a delivery obligation. It was a non-depletion obligation. So in other words, if the flow of the river at Lee Ferry, Arizona, which is where this is measured, is below 75 million acre feet, that initiates an inquiry as to what caused it. That's a complicated question. What we would argue in Colorado is that if we were in that position, there are a lot of relevant factors you should consider. Climate change is one of them. How much each state or each basin is using in Article 3A is another key consideration. For example, if one basin is using far more than 7.5 million acre feet every year, and the other basin is using a lot less than that, we would argue that that should come into the analysis of the inquiry that would occur under Article 3D. So the compact is in place today, and no one is talking about renegotiating it. I don't think it would be a good idea for the state of Colorado, any of the upper division states, or frankly, any of the lower basin states to contemplate renegotiating it because it provides certainty for all of us. And what we know is that if we were to renegotiate the compact, it would look a lot different today and be a lot more complicated. And it begs the question whether we would even be able to do it today. So here are the kind of realities of how things have developed in the basin. And I'm going to talk about, why things have happened the way they have in the last 20 years more. But the location of our major reservoirs, which are highlighted here, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, are both below upper basin uses and above lower basin uses. So what that means in practice, for various reasons, is that in the upper basin, we are really limited by hydrologic conditions. So when the water's not there, we're not getting it. We don't have a major, storage bucket, the likes of Lake Mead or Lake Powell above our uses. We also happen to have a lot of senior water rights right down by the state line. So we can really only use what's legally and physically available in a given year. And when I say legally and physically, what I mean is the state engineer is out administering water rights, shutting them down to priority. So there are a lot of water rights holders in Colorado that don't get their full water rights, and they would use them if they could get them, but they can't use them because the state engineer is out there cutting people off in dry years. So I should have just skipped to the next slide because this kind of explains what I'm talking about here. Because we are so limited in the upper basin, we have used significantly less than 7.5 million acre feet every year, particularly in the last 20 years. And just to explain what you're seeing here, the yellow line, the yellow bar here are upper basin uses. The blue line are lower basin uses. The yellow dotted line is the 7.5 million acre foot apportionment. And then the blue dotted line, let me fact check myself, yeah, is the lower basin 8.5 million acre feet. Another thing you'll note is that in the upper basin, we just have one line because we include our tributaries, evaporation, transit loss, everything is in that line. This is where the tributary part of the compact comes into play. The lower basin has some arguments based on a Supreme Court decree called Arizona v. California, and we don't need to get into that all today. I will say the upper basin states were not party to it. It explicitly does not interpret the compact or revise the compact. At any rate, because of that, because how water is accounted for in the lower basin, they count their main stem uses separately from their tributary uses. So if you go all the way to the top of that blue line, you have total lower basin uses, and that includes tributaries, main stem, and also evaporation and transit losses, which historically have not been counted in the lower basin, again, because they have a legal theory that, I guess, evaporation doesn't occur in the desert. So this is just the reality of how things have developed because of where the major reservoirs are located, because of our geography. Frankly, in Colorado, it's hard to imagine building that big of a reservoir up here, and because we strictly administer water rights, and we do so on an annual basis. So the compact in place has remained in place. We have noted that notwithstanding our roughly equal apportionments, the lower basin is using around 11 million acre feet per year. We in the upper basin are using closer to 3.5 or 4.5 million acre feet a year, depending on the hydrologic conditions. So compact remains in place, notwithstanding the fact that our uses really vary relative to our compact apportionment. But there are a series of agreements that have been layered on top of the compact, the Colorado River Compact, that have provided for, how the system is managed today. And all of these were developed for a variety of reasons. I'm only going to talk about a few of them today. One thing I'm not going to talk about, but I want to mention, is the 1948 Upper Basin Colorado River Compact. You notice that the Colorado River Compact of 1922 does not actually apportion the water by state, only by basin. The upper and lower basins dealt with that issue differently. We developed a compact in 1948 that divvies up our share of our compact apportionment. The lower basin litigated it in many different ways, but the result of all that is that the Secretary of Interior is the water master in the lower basin. So we have really different legal structures in terms of how we operate. So skipping ahead, the next thing I want to talk about, the next kind of big agreement that really informs how the system is operated today, is the 2007 interim guidelines for coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. As the name indicates, these came into place in 2007. They expire in 2026, and I'm going to get to what the current negotiations look like to redo all of that. But I first just want to take a minute and talk about what the 07 guidelines did, kind of what the purpose was, and how they're operating today. So there are really three key components of the 07 guidelines. One is a mechanism to provide for lower basin shortages. Talk about how that works in a second. Second is intentionally created surplus. And that's kind of a lot of words that don't really make sense to say. It's a water banking program for the lower basin. So in certain situations, they get to stash water away in Lake Mead and pull it out later. And finally, Lake Powell operations. There are coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and I'll talk more about that too. But let's first talk about lower basin shortages. So essentially the way this works is that you look at the elevation of Lake Mead, and based on that elevation, you see the lower basin states taking various levels of shortage. In the 07 guidelines, only Arizona and Nevada participate in these shortages, not California, because they, again, have a legal theory that they're not really required to take shortages until Arizona is pretty much dry. And that goes into some legal doctrines I'm not going to talk about today. But at any rate, this is what they agreed to in 07. It's all based on the elevation of Lake Mead. That's when the shortages kick in. That's how it's determined. Intentionally created surplus. So again, this is a water banking program in Lake Mead. It allows lower basin contractors to store water and pull it out later. I'm not going to get into how all the various ways that the lower basin can create intentionally created surplus, but just as an example, one way they can do it is by using less tributary water and claiming that as a credit in Lake Mead. That might raise some questions, given that we all know now that the tributaries are part of the Colorado River system, so they're just using more water from one part of the system and getting a credit for it. We have a lot of other questions about how ICS has operated over the last 20 years and how it has been, how it has led to the faster drawdown of Lake Mead than otherwise would have occurred. Some examples: how much evaporation is being charged on ICS? Probably not quite as much as is actually occurring. So the other thing to note about ICS is that, you know, I said that shortages in the lower basin are determined by the elevation at Lake Mead. Well, if the lower basin is keeping water in Lake Mead, not getting it delivered to them, creating a storage account that they can draw on later, that is actively bumping up the elevation of Lake Mead. That is reducing the shortages that the lower basin would otherwise have to take on a mandatory basis in a way that they can't get that water back. Just some things to note. But here's the meat of it, and this is really what the O7 guidelines are about. So the idea behind the O7 guidelines were to roughly balance the contents of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So the concept was you don't want to see one reservoir really low while the other is really high, so let's try to kind of balance the contents. And the way that that occurs through the O7 guidelines is by looking at this table, looking at the Lake Powell elevation, looking at the Lake Mead elevation, and then Powell's going to release a certain amount of water based on those elevations. So when you think about what is impacting the elevation at Lake Mead, it is lower basin uses. That is entirely what is impacting the elevation at Lake Mead. So the release from Lake Powell is based very heavily on how much water the lower basin is using. If they're using more water, if they are drawing down the elevation of Lake Mead, more water is going to be released from Lake Powell. And that's how these guidelines were designed to operate. They are demand driven, not supply driven. So we're going to skip ahead now to 2019 because, as you may all have figured out by now, those 7 guidelines didn't cut it. Throughout the course of the O7 guidelines, we saw the reservoirs continue to be depleted to very, very low levels. And in 2019, the basin states and the federal government, Bureau of Reclamation, Secretary of Interior came together and said, we need to do something more. We need a Band-Aid essentially to get us through 2026 because we are seeing the reservoirs failing if we don't do something else. So the 2019 DCP, there were lower basin components and upper basin components. In the lower basin, they provided for additional shortages. So you just kind of built out that table that I showed you on lower basin shortages. California actually participates in the DCP. You had new and interesting ways that the lower basin contractors could create intentionally created surplus. In the upper basin, we had 2 main components, and that was consideration of a program that we would call demand management. This is the idea of a really big conservation program in the upper basin designed to put water in Lake Powell. And then certain reservoir releases from our upstream initial units, and I'll talk about all of those. So this is just the kind of universe of agreements and legislation that was required for all of this. You needed federal legislation. You had companion agreements that kind of tied together the upper and lower basin components of this. In the lower basin, you had individual state agreements to go over how they would share in the shortages, how they would create ICS. In the upper basin, we had the demand management storage agreement. That's the conservation concept. And then the drought response operations agreement, and that's for operation of the upstream reservoirs. There's a lot happening here. I'm not going to talk about it all, but this is essentially layering the O7 guidelines on top of the DCP and showing how the lower basin takes shortages when you kind of put it all together. So lots of numbers. Okay, so I want to take a minute and talk about the upper basin components of the DCP. The first one is the demand management feasibility investigation. It really is called the Demand Management Storage Agreement. And the reason we needed an agreement and federal legislation to do this was to say, if the upper basin so chooses, we have the ability to store up to 500,000 acre-feet of water for free in Lake Powell or some other upstream reservoirs, free of charge, and it's invisible to the '07 guidelines. So in other words, if we were to do this, set up a pool of water in Lake Powell, it wouldn't get released subject to those operational tiers I talked about in the '07 guidelines. And the purpose of it would be to create a bank of water that the upper basin could rely on for compact compliance. So hindsight being 2020, the demand management storage agreement is super complex and it requires a whole lot of agreements among the upper division states about how the program would operate, findings we would all have to make before even using it. A lot of hoops you have to jump through, a lot of complications. And I would say, if we were to do this again, it might look a little bit different than the storage agreement did at that time. But it is what it is. So every upper basin state has very different legal structures in terms of how we administer water, how we store water, things like that. So every state really looked at this through their own unique kind of legal policy lens. And you can imagine that for states that have water laws as complicated as Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming, it's a challenge to marry that all up and say, this is how we're going to account for this water. This is how we're going to pass it through our state, shepherd it to the state line. This is how we're going to consider it once it makes it to Powell. So we all had our own feasibility investigations looking at unique issues within our own states. And the idea was that ideally we could come together and put all that together and figure it out and jump through every single hoop in the agreement. Spoiler alert, we have not done that. But the way that Colorado really looked at this was through a few different lenses. So first, is it achievable? Can we actually set up a program of this scale? Can we track the water, administer the water to the state line, things like that? Is it worthwhile? How much water are we actually going to save, especially when considering the extent to which water rights holders are already cut back because of that, water rights administration I talked about earlier? And then finally, is it advisable? So at the time that Colorado and our board was looking at this, there were a lot of things going on the interstate stage that complicated the question, I will say, of whether we thought it really made sense, whether it was really advisable to set up a program like this at this time. So the other component of the Upper Basin DCP was the Drought Response Operations Agreement. And the whole idea behind the DROA, as we call it, was to protect critical elevations at Lake Powell. So again, getting back into the power production issue, the elevation 3525 is kind of a metric that the Bureau of Reclamation uses at Lake Powell to consider whether it's in danger of, not being able to produce hydropower anymore. So when Lake Powell was in danger of hitting that elevation, the upper basin states were to look at our upstream initial units, specific reservoirs in the upper basin, and determine whether and how we could send water downstream to protect Lake Powell. So that indeed did happen. And as a result, the upper basin reservoirs provided 624,000 acre feet downstream to help Lake Powell. So how is all this going? You may already know because you probably read the news, but the '07 guidelines happen to have been in place during the worst drought in the history of the Colorado River Basin, the last 20 years. So part of the story is that we had record low inflows into Lake Powell. We had record low uses in the upper division states. It was very bad. But here's the other side of the story that I think is really important to understand and is critical to our position, the state of Colorado's position in the post-2026 negotiations. I said that, the operations were really demand driven, that releases from Lake Powell were heavily based on what the lower basin states were using. So as a result of all that, the releases from Lake Powell were much, much, much higher than the inflow to Lake Powell. Take 2020 as an example. Well, let's take 2021 as an example. 3.5 million acre feet flowed into Lake Powell, 8.23 million acre feet flowed out. I'm not an engineer, I'm not good at math, but you really don't have to be to see that that's a real problem. And this is what was occurring throughout the course of the '07 guidelines. So there were good years of good inflow, but for the most part, we saw poor inflow into Lake Powell, not a surprise, over the last 20 years. Nonetheless, the releases from Lake Powell continued to be very, very high. I think they averaged, and I'm going to have to, this was based on a couple of years ago, but 8.8 million acre feet at some point was the average recently of releases from Lake Powell. And when you compare that to the hydrology in the basin over that time, just not good. It is not, rocket science why we now have depleted reservoirs. But what I would argue is that it's not just climate change that has caused this. That is a very important part of the equation. But our reservoir operations should have adapted to climate change instead of continuing to release more water than was coming into the system. So this is where that led us. It has been, I've called this slide before, the slide that explains why I haven't slept in a few years. But a crisis. We have found ourselves in a crisis. And for the last 2 years, we've been really managing just to keep Lake Powell and Lake Mead above power pool. So 2022, the Commissioner of Reclamation announced that we need to conserve 2 to 4 million acre feet to save the Colorado River system. Compare that to how much water the entire upper basin used in 2021. That's 3.5 million acre feet. That's a lot of water. We in the upper basin created a 5-point plan to respond to this. And a lot of these are things that I've already talked about. Drought response operations. We sent a lot of water downstream from our reservoirs. We stood up the system conservation pilot program, which is similar to the demand management concept I talked about before, which would be temporary voluntary compensated reductions in consumptive use. This is the same idea, but it just becomes system water, meaning it makes it to Lake Powell and then it just flows downstream. So not protected, essentially, is the idea. But we stood it up in record time. We got pretty good participation. But the reality is that when water users are not receiving water, they don't have water to conserve. So the results of that were really based on hydrologic conditions. We use bipartisan infrastructure law funding to increase measurement, monitoring, reporting. All of that helps us better track where our water is going. But finally, we just continue to do what we've always done in Colorado, which is strictly administer water rates. And our position in Colorado has been that if we just all used based on available supplies and adapted to what was in the river year to year, if we did that across the basin, we would not be in the position we're in now. So our state engineer's office has been busy strictly administering water rights and shutting people down when the water just isn't there. So this brings us to today. The OSEM guidelines expire in 2026. And so as we've been dealing with this crisis situation, we have also been working with the other basin states, the federal government, and trying to develop a consensus approach to how Lake Powell and Lake Mead should be operated into the future. So there's been a lot going on. Just to kind of provide some context on the structure for this, it is a NEPA process. So it is the federal government really running the show. They need to do a complete analysis and select a preferred alternative. But what they're really hoping for is that the basin states come to them with a 7-state consensus and say, here you go, you can drop this in as the preferred alternative. So that's what everyone would really like to happen. And that's what we've been working on. We are meeting as basin states about once a week now. I have been on the negotiating team and going to the meetings with our commissioner, Becky Mitchell. It's been a lot, and it has been contentious, and it has been very challenging. But anyway, to put it back in perspective, right now, the Bureau of Reclamation is considering what alternatives they're going to have in their environmental impact statement. Again, they're really hoping that we will give them an alternative that they can plop in. They have asked us to provide that to them by November 11th, which is coming up really soon. And they would really like the final details of a deal by February 14th so that they can, do the environmental analysis they need. Technically, the operations will go through October 1st of 2026, but the feds really need something before that so that they can, again, kind of run the traps on all this. So going into the negotiations, Commissioner Becky Mitchell went out across the state, talked to a lot of water users. We all really considered, what should our kind of North Star be in these negotiations? What do we want to do better than we did in the OSEM guidelines? What is really important to protect on behalf of the state of Colorado? And we came up with 6 kind of guiding principles that have continued to guide our positions in the negotiations. One, acknowledging climate change is real, which seems like a low bar, but really what we mean by that again is we have to adapt to the reality that we find ourselves in. Number 2, recognizing that water users in the lower basin are not more important than water users in the upper basin. For many, many years now, the lower basin has used millions of acre feet more than their apportionment, and we've used millions of acre feet less. We're not necessarily asking to use 7.5 million acre feet every single year, but what we are asking for is some kind of equity. And this goes back to the compact, the idea of equal apportionment, standing on equal footing, recognizing that California is not more important than Colorado. We simply ask that we be given equal weight in all of this. Number 3, preventing overuse in the lower basin. I think that speaks for itself. Defending against attempts at compact curtailment in the upper division states, it is our perspective that we have always been in compliance with the 1922 Colorado River Compact. We have no intentions of not being in compliance, so there's no reason to come in and enforce mandatory reductions to meet some obligation downstream. Operating Lake Powell and Lake Mead to respond to actual hydrologic conditions. I think I've kind of explained why that's important to us. And finally, preserving federal reserve water rights of the tribal nations. The tribes in the Colorado River Basin have water rights that predate most other water uses in the basin. And they haven't, for various reasons, been able to put this water to use in a lot of cases, including here in Colorado. The tribes that rely on the Colorado River have not used their full apportionment. And so we need to protect their ability to do that into the future and do anything we can to help them get the infrastructure, the funds, whatever else they might need to put that water to use. So all this kind of came together in our upper division states alternative. So again, going back to the NEPA process, various parties submitted alternatives that they wanted reclamation to consider, including the upper division states. And the whole idea here is to rebuild storage in Lake Powell and to have operations that are supply driven rather than demand driven. And the way we looked at that was, do I have another? Yes. Okay. So for Powell operations, we think they should be based on the actual contents of Powell. Powell should not be releasing more water than it, is able to release in a given year. So there are a lot of different ways to get at, a supply-driven operation. We looked at Powell elevations as a metric of hydrologic conditions, and there's a rule curve essentially where, if Powell's fuller, it is releasing more water, and when it's lower, it's releasing less. It's pretty straightforward. We also know, just the bottom line, is that the lower basin is going to have to reduce their uses to balance the system. There's no way around that. We know that an adjustment of 1.5 million acre feet, which roughly approximates evaporation and transit loss in the lower basin, which they haven't accounted for historically, that's going to go a long way. In most situations, that's going to be enough to protect the system. We also know that going into this next interim period with depleted storage, more might be needed, and in some situations, more than 1.5 will be needed. So we called for lower basin reductions up to a total of 3.9 million acre feet, which includes that 1.5. And I should say a key component of that as well is recognition of hydrologic shortage in the upper basin. So we need some recognition that we, in dry years in particular, are already cut down to pre-compact water rates. There are people who have, 1880s water rates that are getting shut off, which by the way would be protected if there were a compact administration scenario. That are getting cut off. And so that needs some recognition, right? We're not saying the upper division states shouldn't have to do anything. What we are saying is that we are paying every single year because we strictly administer our water rates, and the lower basin should begin doing the same. So where are we today? Like I said, we are meeting almost weekly as basin states. The federal government is in the room, and we are trying really hard to see if we can reach consensus. And, I want to be clear that the upper division states alternative is not the only way to have some kind of supply-driven operations at Lake Powell. There are a lot of different ways to look at that. You could look at the natural flow of the river and divvy that up in some way. But the bottom line for us is that we're not going to agree to something that is going to fail the system the way that the 07 guidelines did. Whatever it is needs to be supply-driven, needs to be sustainable, it needs to not put us in this crisis to crisis management scenario we've been in for the last several years, because we all need to sleep a little bit at some point. So whether we'll be able to get there with the lower basin states, I think is yet to be seen, but that is what we are spending our time working on right now. So that brings us up to date. And I think that's all I have for you today, but I'm very happy to take any questions.
Questions for me?
Historically, I guess these past few years, looking at decisions between states on the Colorado River, it seems to be the way it always goes is the upper basin states propose something, the lower basin states or the states in conflict propose something, and they hash it out, and then eventually they can't agree on anything. And then the Fed comes in and brings the hammer down and tells them what to do. As someone in very much in the middle of the 2026 renegotiations, do you think there's any hope for states to come to an agreement, or do you think it's always going to go like it has in the past, and the Fed's gonna have to mandate something?
You know, that's a great question. And that's the question we get all the time is, are the Fed's going to step in and do something? I would challenge the premise though, and say that historically the Feds have threatened to come in and do something. But a lot of the agreements that we have on the river that are governing how we operate, including in the lower basin, are really based on state agreement. They're not perfect. I'm not saying they're even good. But a lot of decisions have been made on a voluntary basis based on pressure from the federal government. And I think that's a pretty good model. So the reality is that the Secretary of Interior has pretty extensive authority in the lower basin to enforce shortages as water master. Since we have a compact in the upper basin, which by the way is federal law, the Secretary doesn't have that type of authority. So might I say that the federal government, it would be helpful for them to step in and say, hey, if you don't come to an agreement, here are the actions we will take as water master in the lower basin. I think that would be helpful. And I think that could help push us along. Do I think there will be an agreement? It really depends on the day. um, I really hope so, because I think it's in everyone's best interest to do that. But the feds, I will highlight, they put out, I can't remember what it was called, an alternatives report, I think. I think it was back in January of this year. And it's really interesting if you go and look at it, they kind of lay out what they might do if there's not a 7-state consensus. They acknowledge their authority in the lower basin to enforce shortages. So that gives us some insight into what the feds might do if we don't have an agreement. But I think what could happen is that if the feds take some kind of action that one state doesn't like, we could very quickly end up in 7-state Supreme Court litigation. And I don't think that's a good outcome for anyone. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Can you talk about what the actual process looks like in the negotiations? Like, what are you bringing to the table? Do you have homework? Like, how does that process actually work? And is there a facilitator? Are they kind of like trying to prevent conflict, or at least find those common threads of what you're agreeing on? Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually going to go back a few slides because there's something I didn't talk about that is very relevant to your question. So, I mean, what it looks like just as a starting point. So each state has a governor appointee who is their negotiator. So each state has one principal. Like I said, ours is Becky Mitchell, who is appointed by the governor to be our negotiator. And they all have teams of a couple people. And I'm one of those people that Becky brings to the meetings. So you start with the basin states and a couple folks that they each have with them. And then you have the federal team. And the federal team changes from time to time, as you can imagine. So their engagement looks different depending on where we are. But right now, the federal team is very engaged. They're in the room and they are trying to help facilitate an agreement. So we don't have a formal facilitator, but the federal government is really acting in that role. Scott Cameron, who was Assistant Secretary for Water, or Acting Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, now acting Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, has been at the meetings, very, very engaged. So I think that what they're doing is trying to bring us together. But some of the things we talk about that I should have touched on more. For example, there are certain components of each of our alternatives that we put forward. For the upper basin, it's parallel activities, where we say, we're going to, depending on what the rest of the deal looks like, we will set up a conservation program in the upper basin. We will do our very best to conserve water when we can. So, some of the discussions might be, well, what exactly would that look like? Tell us more about that. How much water do you think you could conserve? Other times we might be saying, hey, lower basin, tell us about ICS. Are you getting credit in Lake Mead for toilets you installed in the 90s that you think are still saving water? Does that make sense? How much evaporation is being charged? So those are the types of discussions we're having. But also, trying to find, because really the key points of an agreement are the Lake Powell and Lake Mead releases. So you can talk a lot about all the things that are kind of outside of that. But at the end of the day, can we agree on how Lake Powell is going to operate? And that's taken up a large part of the discussion.
Question? I guess I'm curious of how willing all of these states are to compromise. Like, are you seeing that there are discussions where you guys are at least reaching something close to a compromise, or is everyone really steadfast in what they want to the table and things aren't moving?
So I'm not going to get into the details of where we are in the negotiations right now, because we've all as states kind of agreed that we're not going to talk about kind of the day-to-day, but what I will say is that in the lower basin, there have been very big economies built on, around agriculture in a desert. And there are really big, hard decisions that need to be made. So we do see times when I think there are some parties that kind of retreat a little bit and are just not able to say that they will agree to reductions, maybe that they've even previously agreed to. And I don't envy Arizona's or California's negotiators who have, folks from Imperial Irrigation District in their ears, or Central Arizona Project saying, you shall not reduce our uses, that they've come to rely on, which, I feel for them. That's hard, but one might argue that, that development was not really sustainable in the first place. So those are the types of things that are causing roadblocks.
I have a question online that says, great summary of a very complex setup on the river. You've mentioned agreements among all the states. Why do you think states could agree for the 20-some years of drought, but can't now?
So the way that it's important to kind of paint a picture of what things looked like going into the 07 guidelines. There were nearly full reservoirs. Everything was looking pretty kind of okay. Not to say there wasn't conflict, but there was room, I think, to agree to things that we really can't agree to now. We now are teetering on the brink of crisis at Lake Powell. So we need to really understand how that reservoir is going to operate, how downstream operations are going to work. I think a lot of the crunch we're feeling now is the result of having just very, very depleted storage. So we are right on the brink. There's no wiggle room anymore, whereas there was before to kind of look the other way when it came to certain things, water accounting and things like that. Yeah, so I think it's just we're in different territory now. And I mean, we also have some operational experience with the 07 guidelines. We have seen kind of what decisions are made across the basin at low reservoir levels. We've seen how the ICS program works. We might feel more compelled in the upper basin now to say we need more information about that before we can have a deal, because particularly at these very low reservoir levels, that's going to matter a lot. Right now, I think it's around 40% of the water in Lake Mead is intentionally created surplus that the lower basin has a right to pull out at some point. And there's not a lot of water in Lake Mead. So that just kind of highlights why all of these things matter a lot and maybe more than they were perceived to matter in 2007.
One more question online. What is the lower basins alternative for the 2026 negotiations?
So the lower basins alternative, there are a few really key distinctions from the upper basin alternative. One is that you'll notice that we contemplate, in looking at Powell operations and Mead operations, we're only looking at those two reservoirs. The upper basin provided I'm trying to remember exactly, an operational framework for Powell, I think, and Mead that looked at storage higher up in the system. So they're looking at all of our storage, in the crisp initial units, that's Flaming Gorge, Navajo, Blue Mesa Reservoir in Colorado. And they think all that should be considered because they view that as part of their supply. So they think that all that should be considered when looking at how much shortage the lower basin is taking, for example. And if you kind of put that all together, that means they're going to be taking less shortage because that's more, if you go back to what I was talking about how the shortage right now works based on Lake Mead elevations, if you add in all the other water that exists, they're taking less shortage. So there's that. And then I think the really, really big distinction is they believe that beyond their 1.5 in reduction, so once they have hit 1.5 to account for evaporation and transit loss, that the upper basin should be making reductions on a 1-for-1 basis with them. So, and that doesn't mean, what 7.5 to what we're using. That means on top of the shortages we're already facing, they think we should be contributing on a 1-for-1 basis at that point, wet water, which is impossible for a lot of reasons. But I think that's kind of the key, the big issue that we would have with it.
Okay, let's give Amy another round of applause. Great, thanks, Amy.